The story begins with an excerpt from a web novel as a young girl immerses herself in a world of romance and adventure. The novel carried the enigmatic title, "Tyrants Are Demanding a Divorce Because of Me." With each word, each phrase, the girl was immersed more and more in the story, imagining herself in the scene of the action. However, there was one moment that particularly alerted her attention. It was the scene where Rosalina, the protagonist, was in a difficult situation because of her proposed divorce. Her husband, with whom she was married, said that this was the end of their relationship, and upon hearing these words, Rosalina became furious. After that, all words were a blur. He tried to tell her that if she took the name Filesden and returned to Brighton in peace, he would pay her a generous monetary compensation. He put the contract on the table and held it out to Rosaline. The sum of 5 million gold pieces was announced. When Rosaline heard this, her fury was unbounded. Her hands were on her knees, and she crumpled her dress in her hands in anger. But still she could not stand it. In an indignant voice she asked him, "Is he mocking now? Is she Rosaline Filesden?" Looking at him, she said that he was a Filesden too. But the boy sat with an unperturbed look, his arms folded crosswise across his chest. He looked at her without saying a word. Rosaline jumped up from her seat. Tossing the contract aside the guy, she shouted, "Everything belongs to her!" "It was expected," said the reader of this novel, glancing at her phone and flipping to the next page. The girl thought she looked like Rosaline. Decided to take the easy way out. She of course did things a little differently. She would, if she were this character, thank the guy and accept his proposal. What's the point of this novel? The point is that the villain, Rosaline Filesden, she refuses to get a divorce. Rosalina keeps doing all sorts of bad things and ends up being sentenced to execution because of this attempt to poison the main character. The reader, standing at the moment at the crosswalk, she was waiting for the green light with the rest of the people, and at the same moment she was reading a book, a novel on her phone. Flipping through the next page, she thought, "What a fool to behave like this." She knew it was just an affair, but on days like today, even though it was pointless, it helped distract her, and today was just the wrong day for her. Suddenly my cell phone beeped, and a pop-up window popped up saying that the reader owed a sum of money. But she hadn't handed it over yet, because it just wasn't there physically. While the reader was standing at the bus stop reading messages and daydreaming about the novel, she missed the green light. When she looked up, she saw that people were already in the middle of the road. She quickly shifted her gaze to the traffic light that said, "Damn." Seeing the light still green, she thought she could make it just a little bit longer. Well, as it turned out, she just didn't have time to physically cross that road. As she took a step, a red traffic light came on and a huge bus was coming straight at her. The sight was of a bright white light. It was the headlights from this bus. As suddenly a male voice came, "Rosalina!" She couldn't hear it clearly yet, but the voice gave louder and louder. "Rosalina!" The girl blinked and opened her eyes and saw an unfamiliar guy in front of her. She thought he looked kind of strange. He was wearing some kind of themed suit, a knitted scarf instead of a tie. He was wearing gloves, and he told her she could hear him, handing her some papers across the table. The girl wondered, who was this and where was she? Until a second ago, she remembers the white light in front of her and the huge windshield of the bus that was sure to hit her. She began to wonder, where is she? Looking at her hands, the girl noticed that they didn't look like hers. And then there were the fishnet sleeves of her dress. As she looked around her, she noticed that to her right was a magnificent window, like a gateway to another world. It was huge, almost to the ceiling, and the light streaming through it cast a delicate golden glow over the room. But this window was not like all the others in her modest apartment. It was a work of art, carved from wood and decorated with open-work shutters. Going to the window, she decided to examine herself, because she was reflected in it. The girl asked what color hair and clothes it was. Could it be wow? What a beauty she was! And then a thought crept into the girl's mind. Could it be Rosaline Filesden? Could she have taken over her body? How could that be? The girl went back to the table, sat down and looked at the guy. The situation seemed familiar to her. Those papers he held out for her to look at, but she didn't remember exactly what it was about. The reader began to remember a familiar situation, which she had described in her novel. There, too, the guy had said that if she returned to the name Filesden and went back to Brighton in peace, he would pay her a generous sum of money. But the real Rosalina refused the money. She screamed at him then and threw the contract away. Suddenly the guy started saying things that there was no point in dragging out the time if they were going to quietly separate. He would pay her 5 million gold pieces as compensation. After saying that, as if struck by lightning, she was stunned by the amount. She coughed harshly because she had just choked on her drool due to imagining where she would spend it. The guy sighed. He didn't like it. It seemed to him that she didn't cough. She started to cry. There was no point, he said. Like he said, her tears don't affect him. Yes, but our heroine was not crying at all, but was thinking about 5 million gold pieces in her head. Leaning lower, the girl just had a thrill at those words. That's 50 billion in Korean won. The girl had already imagined a mountain of coins. And the guy kept faintly nourishing something in my ear, to the effect that everyone should be where they belong. The reader shouted sharply that she understood everything, pointing her finger at the contract. She asked where she should sign. Not a meddler, not a second. She put her scrawl in the document, placing the quill on the table. Taking these documents after signing them, she poked them into the guy's chest and said, "There you go. Looks like she did everything she was supposed to do." The tired girl headed for the exit with a smile on her face. She mumbled that she would go then, since all the issues had been resolved here. The guy started flipping through all these documents that had her signature from each one. He was shocked that it had happened so fast. He asked her to wait. The reader, going to the door, opening it, she turned and said that he thought she would behave inappropriately. But everything happened quickly, and as he wanted it to. That's the end of their relationship. Saying bye, the girl went outside. She was full of good mood and optimism. Now she had such a large amount of money. As she approached her carriage, the coachman saluted her by saying, "Madam, where shall I take you?" And the reader thought that the first thing to do was to get to the Duke of Brighton's mansion, and instructed the coachman to take her there. After all, after what happened today, her fate had changed drastically. It all started when Rosalina was born. That was many, many years ago. She was a bright and kind child, and her mother was very fond of her. But it was only the condition of the Brighton family that was gradually deteriorating. Perhaps it was for this reason that Rosaline was always called the Trouble of Brighton. The girl has always struggled to be loved, but in return she hears whispers about how sinister she is. After all this speculation, Rosalia became so offended that the girl renounced love. The one person she couldn't refuse was Arzentian Filesden, but they ended up getting divorced. She realizes there's going to be a lot of fuss about the divorce, however. Rosaline was executed for trying to poison the novel's protagonist. There's no way she's gonna die like that. Whatever happens, she'll do her best and divorce Arzentian. Plus, now she's no longer just a reader of this novel, but she's now the heroine of Rosaline Filesden. The carriage began to pull up to the Duchy of Brighton. It's a huge palace with gardens and fountains. Now I can see why there isn't enough money to maintain it all. At this point in the palace, the butler is recounting the work that has been done. He holds a paper in his hand, on which he reads out that the restoration of antique and broken items has been completed. Crystalware, carpets, engraved with the Brighton seal, and also... Before he could continue, there was a knock at the door. At this moment, the Duke of Brighton was sitting at his desk, listening to the butler's report, studying the papers. The Duke replied, "Come in." A maid entered, bowing. She said, "Duke, you have a visitor." The woman was already agitated. The Duke interjected, "A visitor? What kind? He wasn't expecting anyone, was he?" The maid replied that Mrs. Filesden had come to see him and was waiting for him. Duke became very angry at once. He was not prepared to meet her today. He growled for the maid to send Rosaline back. But the maid replied that the girl had said she just had to meet him and wasn't going anywhere. The Duke thought how insolent she was, and said that then there was nothing left for her to do but wait for him. Telling the maid to tell her to tell him to let her wait, the Duke went to the window to take his mind off the matter a little. Then he turned and saw that the maid had not yet gone, and he called out to her at the end, "Just get all the chairs out of the way, and don't give her any water." Let her suffer a little, he thought. After that, the Duke went to the table, to do his business. The Duchy did not notice how the time flew by, and it was not morning, but evening. He even had candles lit already because it was hard to see into the room. The Duke took off his glasses, saying, "Phew, because he was tired from a whole day's work, and put them on the table. He said that was enough for today, rubbing the bridge of his nose from the fact that his eyes couldn't see anything at all anymore, because it was already evening. A butler came into the room. The Duke asked what was the matter. The man came over, leaned over, and said in his ear that Mrs. Filesden was expecting him. The Duke exclaimed, "Is she still here?" He had already forgotten about her. During all this time, Rosalina, waiting outside the door, walked from side to side to stretch her legs in some way. She hadn't thought it would be this easy, but still. He does seem to be very unhappy about her coming. Apparently, this is his way of punishing his adult daughter for past mistakes. The girl was already desperate, but still she pulled herself together because she absolutely had to show her confidence. She knew how the Brighton family had gone bankrupt, so he can find a way to help. That's the privilege of someone who's inhabited the body of a character in a book. He knows everything ahead of time. Even if their negotiations go badly for her, it's not over. This is the first time she's ever seen anything like this. She's never been as patient as she is now. Suddenly the door opened and her father came out. The girl flinched at the words, "father." So it wasn't as bad as she thought. The Duke came out of the room to her with an unkind face and asked, "What has she forgotten here, Duchess Filesden?" Rosalina said she came here with one request. After all, women have no right to make decisions here. If one wants a divorce, one must unconditionally get the permission of both the husband and the father. And to go broke and get 50 billion, she needs to be strong, as there is such a huge amount at stake. The girl clutched her dress nervously in her hands and decided to herself that she would definitely get her way. Approaching her father, she said emphatically that she wanted a divorce decree. My father was puzzled. How to divorce? She's out of her mind. He said, "What, have you forgotten how crazy you were about Arzenthion years ago?" Then she shouted that the trouble of Brighton would leave this mansion on its own. She hates this place, so when she gets married, she will never come back here. By the way, that night she stole the family seal and got married, and now she's here for a divorce. How could that happen? Though his father said he wouldn't be surprised by anything anymore, Rosaline told him, "She's changed a lot. It's going to be different from then and now." The girl said she wasn't asking you to believe them. To her words, she offered to make a deal. Her father turned and interjected that she wanted to make a deal, and Rosaline confidently replied that yes, she was asking him to make a deal with her on the condition that he let her get a divorce. She'll make a promise that she can help revitalize the Brighton family, and then Brighton's business will pick up. She'll prove it to him in 1 year. The girl, putting her hand on her heart, said she swore to Brighton that she would make it work. At this moment, a butler was standing nearby. He thought it was unfounded confidence and boldness. It had not changed. Her father called the butler and told him to prepare a room for his daughter. The butler was very surprised. He asked for the exact room, but the Duke said he would not repeat himself twice as the butler bowed and said he would escort her mistress to her room. Later, when the room was ready, then Rosaline thought that at last she was back in Brighton. How long she had waited for this. The girl urgently went into the room and lay down on the bed because her legs were just twisting in pain. She stood and walked for probably 5 hours while she waited for her father to admit her. Rosaline couldn't get enough of lounging in her bed. She shifted from left to right and thought she was finally feeling better. The girl thought about it and remembered that in her past life she had dropped out of university and was not out of debt. And now there is an unexpected chance to live a second life. Such luck will never happen again, so she can't miss this chance. Especially this time, she can handle it much better than the heroine of the book. All she has to do is act differently than Rosaline did in the novel. The girl exclaimed, "Yes, it's even easier than her eternal contractions. She'll definitely get over it." That same evening, while Rosaline was lounging in bed resting, the butler came to him and asked why the Duke had agreed to this. The best way to put it was to say that nothing had changed. The Duke thought about it, looking at his reflection in the cup of tea. After all, he had told her to wait, and she had waited. Rosaline would never have sat silently in the living room before. Not for so many hours. When she was made to wait, she broke everything in sight, smashing and smashing and smashing vases. Normally, a monstrous mess would have awaited them. But this time, none of what had happened before had happened at all. Then the father decided to give his daughter one last chance. Maybe something had really changed in her. The next morning came. It was as beautiful as the previous one, sunny and warm. Rosalina woke up in her bed. The girl had had a wonderful night's sleep. Pulling herself up, still barely opening her eyes. Then she heard the maid say, "Mistress, are you awake?" The maid asked her to prepare a bath for her, and Rosalina said yes. Then the maid prepared her a warm bath with rose petals and rose foam. The girl went into the bathroom to take off her robe and hand it over to the maid. While handing over the robe, the maid accidentally touched Rosa with her hand and was very frightened at once. She began to shake off the face of the machine. I thought Rosalina was about to start screaming. When Rosaline looked at the maid, she couldn't understand what was happening to her at all. Maybe she felt sick, or maybe she saw something. The maid began to shriek, "Excuse me, it's Mistress Rosaline! She will never touch your precious body again. Please forgive her, she has 9 children and big debts. Just fire her." Those words made Rosaline herself break out in a sweat. She didn't understand at all what had happened, what she had done that the maid was acting like this. The maid fell to her knees with her head on the floor. Everything told her that she had committed a deadly sin. Please have mercy on her, she won't do it again. And then Rosaline realized that the maid was worried because she touched her, and since that was the reaction, the previous Rosaline didn't like it. But now Rosaline was completely different. She smiled and said that it was no big deal. She could go. The maid herself was very surprised. "How to go, Rosaline?" I replied about yes, you may go, and the girl began to bathe. The maid replied, "Good, call me if you need anything," and removed herself from the room. When the maid came to the others, she was very disturbed. Her friend asked what was wrong with her, and the girl replied that Mrs. Rosaline had just said, "Nothing is wrong," after she touched her. But her friend didn't believe it after feeling her forehead. She said she needed to rest because she was imagining things. It couldn't be. At this moment, Rosalina in her bathroom, taking it, thought after seeing her face reflection, "If she doesn't smile, she looks so ugly, her face turns out very sullen. That's probably why everyone is afraid of her, because a face without a smile looks like a mean face." She herself got goosebumps all over her body after seeing her reflection. Then she decided for herself that she would smile so that people would think she was not evil. When Rosalina had finished her bath, coming out of it and going into her room, she saw the maids gathered to help her dress. The girl said, "She is ready for the fitting of the dress." All the maids who were in the room were very surprised and opened their shorts. One of them dropped a local magazine. Rosaline walked over, picked it up, and looked at what it said. One of the maids shrieked, "Mrs. Rosalina!" Before she could prove what it was, Rosalina read it all herself. Magazine. It was the April issue, called Gossip Girl. The news of the year was that this time they had one secret from the lovely lady. Exclusive. The hero of the empire is getting a divorce. Then Rosalina opened the right page, began to read. It said, "Exclusive. The hero of the Filesden Empire is getting a divorce." And a small description of the article about being the sole heir of the Filesden family, which is considered the most powerful in the empire. And Arsentian Filesden himself is considered the youngest swordsman. All the battles in which he took part ended in his victory. But not the marriage with Rosalina, which was more like a war, and which he is trying to end. I wonder who will take the seat that will soon be vacated. The lines from the journal said. Rosaline frowned, but she didn't yet realize, after reading the journal, whether that was good or bad. A maid came into the room and said, "Mrs. Rosalina, a letter has come for you." At that moment, Rosalina was pulling up. Turning around to the maid, she said, "Really?" Taking the letter, she thought, it looks like she had friends after all, despite her bad temper. When Rosalina turned the letter around to see who it was from, she saw the seal of the Duke of Filesden. Taking a special knife to open this letter, the girl opened the envelope. She thought that the Duke was disappointed that she had reacted calmly to the divorce. But I saw a check in the envelope that fell out when I opened it. The check said it was written for 1,000,000 gold pieces. The girl thought it was 10 billion won. The envelope also contained a letter stating that it was a down payment of the promised percent amount. He sent her a check, hoping she hadn't changed her mind. Signed at the end, Arzention Fielden. Rosalina was only glad. Now she had even more motivation. She asked the maid to bring her some unsightly cloak. The girl had a plan. Rosalina decided to attend an auction of very rare and expensive items since she now had money. It was announced in the hall that everyone had waited so long for this. This lot was called Tears of the Wind. Who will take it? Who gets it? The man announced. Rosalina, when she saw this lot, she was overjoyed. At last, she thought she would have the Tears of the Wind. With their help, she can break Leodor's curse. The letter Arzentian had written her, Rosalina thought to herself. Her wallet was just thick enough right now. The auction hadn't started yet, but Rosalina was already triumphant. It seemed so easy, and she felt that the Tears of the Wind were almost in her hands, and she would spend the rest of the money on goodies. And after only a few minutes, Rosalina puffed up like a tomato, because she had jumped to conclusions. She fought very hard for these Tears of Wind, and participated in the auction. She kept putting in a bid, like 600,000 gold, but she always had an opponent. There was a man standing nearby, covered by a black cloak. He always bid a little more money than her, and this time he said 700,000 gold. She was really pissed off. Every time she was about to win an auction, this guy got in her way and offered her a higher bid. But she had 1,000,000 gold pieces in her hand. But with all this bidding, that money was almost gone. Again, Rosaline says 800,000, and this guy says 900,000 gold pieces. Then Rosalina firmly decided that she would have to make this bet and put the entire amount on the line at once. She held up the sign and said, 1,000,000 gold pieces, or rather, she shouted it across the room. And she won. The boy no longer outbid her. This elixir was a well-deserved victory in her hands. Rosaline cheered. "Here come the Tears of the Wind," she said, raising the vial upward. Something, at least. It was starting to work. The girl went outside and proceeded to her carriage, but this guy in a black cloak began to chase her. Not far away, he shouted that he wanted to offer her a deal. Rosalina only heard the word deal. Turning around, she interjected deal. The guy caught up with her and said, "You don't just have this pretty thing? Is it something you might be interested in? You don't have any use for it?" The guy said, if you give it to him, he's willing to offer 5,000,000. After these words, Rosalina went closer to him to get a closer look at his face, but unfortunately she couldn't. He had a mask on his face, and on top of it, on the baby, writing. He and all his clothes were covered with a long black robe. It was unclear what kind of person this was. The girl was a little frightened. "No need," said Rosaline. "Such a large sum. What is he talking about?" She did not understand. Then she shouted, "If he had 5,000,000 from the beginning, why didn't he win the auction? It's suspicious, isn't it?" The guy mumbled somehow, began to speak slurred somehow. Rosaline interrupted him and said, "She knows the purpose of this thing perfectly well. No need to hang superficial labels on it." She said she really needed it because she wanted to help her sick brother, and that was more important than any money. The girl is furious. What was he thinking so petty about her? She grabbed the guy by the scruff of that dress and started shaking him and yelling at him to give up while she talked nice. But the guy felt sick somehow. He knew it was happening to him, because he questioned why the madness was happening now, and Rosalina noticed that something was wrong with him. She asked him if he had heard what she was telling him. The guy closed and opened his eyes, squinted really hard because something was wrong with him. He pulled his hood down a little lower so his eyes couldn't be seen, and said he understood everything, that she needed an item to help her family. The guy asked me to excuse him. The guy pointed out that her carriage and escort were already waiting for her, so you should go. Suddenly, Rosalina held out her hand, and in it was a handkerchief. The boy asked what it was. The girl replied, "It's a handkerchief. Wipe your sweat. It looks like you've gotten sick." The guy rejected the handkerchief and said he didn't need it. It was fine. She smiled and said, "How do you mean you don't want him because she offers to take him?" The girl starts stalking the guy. He steps aside. She goes after him and says, "Just accept the gift for giving her this elixir." But the guy says he can't take her handkerchief anyway. Then Rosalina quickly took her handkerchief and wiped his face, then said, "Oh, I think you've already used it, so you'll have to take it back." When Rosaline did that, the guy was surprised. He thought it was because of the madness. He feels pain. As she left, Rosalina waved her hand and said that you would return the handkerchief when you had a chance. When Rosalina left, the boy took off his mask, and under the mask was Duke Arzentian. He was surprised by Rosalina's behavior and said that she had changed somehow. The Duchy of Brighton, the Duke's father's study. The Duke is listening to a report. A who's who of the workers, who is talking about putting out a fire in the grounds, says the following. and again they were interrupted because a servant girl came into the room. The woman said, "I'm sorry, Duke." He asked what had happened. Mistress Rosalina made a fuss in front of the young master's room. "Miss Eliza is not doing well on her own." At this moment the Duke, when he heard this, broke his quill with anger, after which he shouted very loudly, "Rosalina!" and pounded his fist on the table. He thought that he had just given her a chance, and then it happened again. He headed for the young master's room. On the way, he wondered if he had been so foolish as to trust her, Duke said when he gave her a chance after such a betrayal. Going to the door, he swung it open and shouted, "Rosalina!" A little background. Long ago, Brighton lost two treasures: Beatrice, the mistress of the family, and a very ancient patron of Brighton. The moment little Rosalina broke a tree branch, the fairy, enraged, the fairy cast a curse. Leodore fell into eternal sleep, and Beatrice was cursed in place of Rosaline, who protected her by throwing her body over the child, thus saving her. After a severe shock, Beatrice went into premature labor, and as a result, Beatrice died. Only young Rosalina remained, who had lost her memory in the shock. She was the only person who saw everything. She was cursed. It's a miracle she survived. There was Eliza, who worked as a maid for Beatrice. So now Eliza is standing in the room, asking for it to be given to her, holding out her hand to Rosaline. She can't have her feeding Leodore something suspicious. But Rosaline replied that there was nothing suspicious, and she could prove it. Eliza said that Leodore is like her own child, and if he doesn't want to go along, she has no choice. She waved her hand and said, "Dorota." Maid Dorota bowed and said, "Mistress, she begs pardon," turning to Rosaline, "something will have to come out." At that moment my father burst into the room shouting, "Rosalina, she really is." As soon as her father walked in, Eliza rushed into his arms and began crying to him, telling him that Duke Rosalina had tried to feed Leodore something suspicious. The Duke asked what she was up to this time. "Answer me!" Then Rosalina showed the vial of potion she was going to give to her brother. Opening it, she took a little drink and said it was the tears of the wind. "You can see for yourself there's no poison." She drank it and she's still alive. That's the medicine that's supposed to help her brother. Elise cried out, "How are they supposed to believe that?" Rosaline said that if they didn't believe her, they could trust the Filesden family, couldn't they? They were an incredible family. She had read about the tears of the wind in a secret cabinet where only the head of the family could enter. Although the girl had actually read it in a novel, she had plenty of time to learn about something new. 3 years she spent alone. Eliza said, "Would his daughter be able to get into a place that only the head of the family is allowed to enter?" Father shouted, "Enough, it's quite possible. Rosaline always gets what she wants." Her father indicated that she could approach her brother. Rosalina thought, "Great, now the road is open." As she approached him, she thought that she must save Leodore from the curse and gain the Duke of Brighton's trust. But the girl herself doubted if it would work. Her hands trembled as she opened that vial of potion. Still gathering all her courage, she poured the potion into her brother's mouth, hoping it would work. A few minutes later, the guy started to open his eyes after so many years of sleep. Everyone screamed, "Leodore!" Everyone was surprised and ecstatic that the cure had worked after all, or Leodore would be able to live. The guy who opened his eyes said the first word was Rosa, meaning Rosalina, his sister. He saw her and recognized her, even though she was such a grown-up girl. She ran up to him and asked, "What, brother?" He touched her to feel her, and said, "Looks like she's already become a lady." Just as suddenly the guy started to close his eyes and fell asleep again. "It's the curse of the fairies," Rosalina thought as she walked over to her brother. She said she would do her best to make sure he finally woke up. She didn't know if he could hear her or not, but she had to tell him that, and only suspiciously sidestepped Eliza, who was not happy about what had happened. She didn't really want Leodore to come to his senses, so she was hiding something. A little later, in Rosaline's father's study, he said, "Doesn't she want anything?" "Keep your jokes to yourself," objected the Duke. He began listing dresses and jewelry. "He'll bring anything." Rosalina thought the Duke would bring her whatever she wanted, but he didn't look pleased. What about what she'd asked for as a child? A summer house. Rosaline thought for a moment. A summer house. The father tried to say something more. Maybe he could. But Rosaline interrupted him, saying, "Duke, she is Leodore's sister, and she did what she had to do. So she doesn't need any reward. If this conversation is over, she'll go." The girl stood up and walked to the door, taking hold of the handle. The door, she said. And no, there's something else. And then the Duke thought, that's what he thought, that she was about to come up with some kind of reward for herself. And all the girl said was that she knew he was very busy, but please, could he please spend more time with Leodore? Maybe then he would feel much better and start to recover. When Rosalina left, my father went to her portrait hanging on the wall. He looked at it and realized that Rosalina had changed, not as she had been before. So there was hope for him after all. Well, what are the lights? At that moment, the Duke heard a servant girl not far away apologizing to Mistress Rosalina. He stepped closer to see what had happened. The servant girl was crawling on the floor beside her. A bucket of water spilled, which she had inadvertently tipped over onto the mistress herself. Now she was crawling on her knees and begging for forgiveness, and not to kill her. But Rosaline's answer was just like the previous one. "It's okay," she said, smiled, and went to her room to change that dress. Her father saw all this and realized that she had wised up to the Filesden family. He also remembered Rosalina saying beside his brother that she would try to help him wake up as soon as possible. She had promised, and only Eliza was not very pleased with Rosaline's return. It pissed her off that the girl had been granted a divorce and had officially returned to Brighton. Because of helping Leodoru, she came back, making an excuse for herself. The vile wench pondered to Eliza what she should do now. With her legs folded over the maid who was on all fours and Eliza's legs resting on her back, Eliza pondered about her need to chase Rosalina out of here, and how on earth I was going to do that. She didn't realize yet. Eliza then asked the maid, "Has she cleaned yet?" shoving her foot into her side so that the maid fell over. Eliza added that this was the first time she had seen this new maid. She doesn't seem to have been trained yet on how and what to perform. Eliza then picked up the whip. Leaning over to the girl, she said, "It's okay, don't worry. She'll free up some time for you to fix it." Eliza stood up and picked up her whip, speaking, "In return, maid, you must say thank you after each stroke." Lisa shouted that she didn't hear if the maid understood her, and the girl only replied, "Miss," before receiving several whip strokes. The next day morning, her father called Rosaline into his study and told her the happy news. The girl exclaimed, "He approves of the divorce." The father confirmed, "Yes, Brighton gives his approval. Also, that's not all. He's giving her back her last name and all the rights she had." The Duke asked one small request. It would be nice for him if she started calling him father again, but Rosaline answered him nothing. Then he asked her if she was listening, but she was already in the clouds of joy that she had fulfilled part of her promise. Putting her hands up in the air, she yelled that she did so in a very good mood, from everything that was going on, and she was one step closer to divorce. The only girl pondered the rest of the monetary compensation, 40 billion won. It's not enough. After all, as paradoxical as it may sound, it would take more money to save 4 million gold. In this world, divorce is considered a disgrace for a woman. Therefore, there is a tradition that a girl returns to her birth family and tries to make a marriage of convenience. In the first marriage, the girl's property brought from her birth family is left to her, but the repeated one carries the meaning, "Thank you for accepting her," and the betrayed one goes to her husband's family. So she has only one way out: buy back the title and become independent. For that she needs money, and even more money than she has now. After the happy news, Rosalina went to her room. When she got there, she lay down on her bed to think hard about everything. Suddenly, out of the blue, she sees something very bright on the ceiling and hears a voice saying that the fate has changed more than 3 times. To activate the system, the Pioneer Fate energy is created. A pop-up blue window appeared on the ceiling that notified Rosalina of all this. She didn't understand anything yet, but the pop-up kept writing something new and saying that the summoner's specialty of summoning invisible world objects is awakening. The breaker rating is F. Rosalina asked, could she change her destiny and become rich? The system window alerted again that fate energy was being accumulated every time she deviated from the set path. She needs to raise her summoning level with the accumulated fate energy and unlock new abilities. It was hard for the girl to accept. The energy of destiny, new abilities, the system and the pop-ups. Was this really a romance fiction game she had only heard of? She sees the road of the future lined with flowers. "No, it will be of brilliant shining gold," cried Rosaline. While in her room, Rosalina thought it was time to create some sort of plan. She sat down and thought about it to remember what happened next in the novel. Where would she get such a huge amount of money? And she remembered that there was a mine in the mine. This mine is very deep and unusual, and only the evil Rosalini would never have guessed what is at the bottom there, because only the reader of this novel knows such moments. Then the evil Rosaline called the novel's main character Daisy to come and meet her. She asked her if she liked the mine. Daisy replied that yes, it was very beautiful. Angry Rosaline began to tell her that this mine was given to her for her 14th birthday, even though it was just abandoned now. And Rosaline drew up a document that says that Daisy is now the owner of these mines. She held out her hand with this document and said, "Here," she gives it to you, in honor of their becoming friends. The title deed to the mine. Daisy took it and said how could she accept something so expensive. Then Rosaline leaned over to her and said in her ear to take it, for while she was still asking her nicely. The girl went on to say that in addition, this place has real value, pointing her finger in the middle. She said, "Look over there. The purification lake is believed to be empowered by a fairy and has some magical properties." Daisy walked up to this lake, bent down to look down, and saw her reflection. She said, "It's very beautiful." Then Rosaline said that since she liked it so much, she was very glad too, and pushed Daisy into this lake. Daisy flew screaming into that lake because there was nothing to even hold on to. Rosaline stayed upstairs to keep watch. She said, "Got it. Even if she manages to get out of the lake, she still won't escape." She stood and watched the girl sink lower and lower. It was an elaborate trap that took into account hypothermia due to the low temperature. And the tangles of the mine passages, perhaps a matter of the protagonist's buffs, have safely sunk to the bottom, where she saw a large number of hidden magical stones. And to top it off, the main character, Alex, came to her rescue, thanks to which they were able to discover each other's feeling. It was in this episode that the protagonist noticed the evil deeds that Rosalina was pulling, and only our reader knew what was in the novel. She had surrendered to herself that she needed to avoid all bad things and do only good things. So the girl had already decided for herself where she would go and what she would do. While she was thinking about it all, and in the meantime she dressed in pants and a shirt so that she would be comfortable. After all, her choice determines the rest of her life. So you have to make it. Go into the lake and get 10 billion or do nothing. Coming to that mine and coming to that lake, taking off her shoes, Rosalina stood pondering whether to jump or not. But then she realized that the more she pondered, the longer it would take to decide. The girl accelerated sharply and jumped. It wasn't until she was in the water that she thought, wait, what if something goes wrong? Or what if only Daisy, the main character, was capable of that? At this very moment, the shadowy information guild Henis, chained to the wall, Arsenion agonized in pain, not knowing what to do himself. The madness of the Filesden family, which has been passed down through generations, is really quite horrible. His personal assistant came to Arsenion with a report. Arsenion, freed from his chains, sat down at the table and asked what about the research results on the thing he was giving. The aide replied that the research of wizards and shamans showed that this most common handkerchief. Arsenion, himself not knowing what the handkerchief was, said, "Go away," to his assistant, and the assistant, who said, "Yes," ran away. Arsenion, who had opened the drawer of his nightstand, saw this handkerchief lying there. He wondered what this woman had done to him with the handkerchief. He took it and put it to his forehead, and thought that the continent's best doctor, the strongest wizard of the magic tower, and even the shaman that is known for his bad reputation, none of them could stop this suffering. His heart freezes at first and then heats up sharply, as if his body was engulfed in flames, as if it were being torn apart. A terrible curse that pulls at him like metal chains. Arsenion clasped the handkerchief in his hands and wondered what was wrong with it, what she had done to it. Rosaline, a female leech who used Filesden to gain power over people. Rosalina was ready to do anything for that, even confess her love to him. But only at that moment she looked different, when she gave him the handkerchief and left. How well did he know her? His assistant ran into Arsenion's office. He said that Miss Filesden was in the drawing room. Then the guy put on a cloak and a mask that hid his eyes. Coming into the living room, he said, "I apologize for keeping you waiting." Rosalina was sitting on the couch and was all wet. She was just wringing her hair out of the water. Arsenion said, "Duchess," in a surprising voice, What happened to you? The girl laughed and said she was here to pick up her handkerchief. Then Arsenian asked why she had come here in the first place. Sitting down at the table? Then Rosalina stood up and said that she was building the foundation for her bright future, but would keep the details a secret. 2 years ago, the border of the empire. Arsenian was right on that border. The knight was giving a report to Arsenian, and when he finished, he said that was the end of the report. When suddenly the Duke's voice rang out. A messenger brought a letter. He said there was an urgent letter from the mansion and gave it to the Duke. When the Duke opened the letter and began to read, it stated that the Duchess was dying. We should return soon. The boy thought indignantly that he was engaged to a woman whose face he couldn't even see. A woman who pretends to be a duchess. And now she's dying. Unbearable! Rosaline Brighton shivered with anger. Arsenian burned the letter. Still, he got on his horse and rode to her mansion. Upon arrival, he didn't immediately run to her, but decided to peek to see what was going on. There were maids, butlers, and servants all running around, darting about, and that was just around the garden. Outside, Rosalina was running around and handing out orders that blue curtains wouldn't work. We needed black ones to make it look funereal. The servants bowed and said they wouldn't have enough time to find the black ones specifically. And then Rosaline asked indignantly, "Does he mean to say that he can't do it?" After saying that, the servants ran and ordered the others to remove the curtains. Afterward, Arsenian made sure she was alive and fine and absolutely not dying. This must have been a trap, the boy thought. He was just about to leave when he heard it. Rosaline's voice finally. It had come. The boy hid behind a column, but she called out to him, "Arsenian!" The guy thought, could she really even sense his presence? Stepping out from behind the pillar, he said, "So she's still alive. Why this ridiculous spectacle?" She told him to come here, plucking a lily flower. She brought it up to her nose and sniffed it. Arsenian asked, "What is the meaning of this?" The girl stepped closer to him and said that she thought the news of the suicide would at least briefly get his attention. Sure, the chance was small, but it worked. She asked, "Is he just going to stand there like that?" Into the flower, the girl said she realized it when she first saw it. They're connected to destiny. Now he doesn't have to go to the battlefield. He can just stay with her. But the guy didn't like it very much. He shouted, "Enough!" pushing her away from him. "Selfish and obnoxious woman!" He suggested, "Perhaps it would be better to kill her? A little force of the hand is enough to make this fragile neck break." Then Rosaline ran up to him, took hold of his head and said, "Has his insomnia increased? It is dangerous." Rosalina reached out to him and told him he needed to get some sleep and then he would feel better. The next morning, the boy woke up in the same bed with Rosalina. He was suspicious. He fell asleep. How? What was done to him? He realized she was a dangerous woman, and he didn't know what else she could do to him. A thought crept into the guy's mind if he was going to kill her now, but still he changed his mind. After all that, he put on his black cloak and galloped away, leaving Rosalina at her estate. Arsenian had been so deeply immersed in the memories that Rosaline was now waving in front of his eyes and asking, "Can he see and hear her?" The guy finally switched from memories to real life. Looking at her, he said, "You were talking about the scarf?" Rosalina replied that yes, she was here to get it because she didn't have it at the moment. Along the corridor unhurriedly walked the assistant, carrying under his nose with 2 cups of tea. Nothing portended trouble. Since there was no cry of "What?" from Arsenian's office, the boy was so frightened that he fell under his nose along with the cups. To get into the shadowy Henis organization, you need to find the antique store at the end of the alley, the one closest to the statue of the first emperor. On top of all that, one had to play a game of chess. It was a code name, and say that one had come to meet the guild head, Henis. Arsenian told her that he didn't have a handkerchief at the moment. Rosalina wondered why he spoke so smugly. He seems to have been planning to throw it away from the beginning, she thought, and asked how there was no handkerchief. Had he lost it? For it was the only gift from her husband, the girl cried out, a treasure she would not trade for any gold. What impertinence, she said. And then Arsenian wondered, he that was giving her a handkerchief. After all, it's the most ordinary one, if it's so expensive. Why would you give it away? He thought. Then he asked, begging pardon, miss, if he could find out when she received this gift. The girl said, "Isn't gathering information? Isn't that the job of the Henis Guild?" Not only has he lost his handkerchief, he's also asking rude questions. She said she was leading big hopes for this seat, but now she's disappointed. The guy thought, so she had other goals. Rosalina said that it didn't look like he was worthy of the title of the best guild in the empire. The guy replied, "Whatever you say." The conversation between these two young men was more like a cat and dog fight. And it was only the assistant Arsentientian who was absolutely loath to go in and fetch tea for them, because he felt like a mouse in this situation. Then the guy said he had no excuse. He couldn't give the handkerchief back. In return, if she's interested in something, she can be compensated with Henis services, if that would suit you. Well, the guy's thinking about it. If she said yes, he would have a chance to find out something. Then Rosaline replied, "Well, since that's the way it is, he's going to go far." She couldn't agree more. This time she'll give in, but only this time. The girl told him everything. Argentillon asked, "Does she need money and title to divorce and protect herself from remarriage?" "Yes," answered Rosaline. "Now who would want a second marriage of convenience? She just wants to accumulate wealth under another name, buy a title, and live alone." Rosalina rejoiced. Good thing the guild leader is a quick thinker. No need to chew everything up. She just saw this white mask at an auction and recognized it immediately. It is owned by a master of the Henis Guild, a high-class organization that can be relied upon for any request. But they can refuse, even if you pelt them with gold. She had a risky plan, but she succeeded. She's good, and if you look closely, he looks great, and she has a familiar feeling about him, as if she's seen him before. Rosaline hesitated a bit when she heard the guy already shouting, "Miss, are you listening?" The girl was a little frightened, so much so that she fell out of her chair and the cup broke. The guy immediately jumped up to help her. He happened to put his arm around her slightly. They both didn't expect it. Looking into each other's eyes as the assistant burst into the room, they immediately scattered to the corners. The assistant came running in shouting, "Master! What happened?" And the master said, "Morris, go and fetch all the papers about getting another name, and also need a list of titles that are for sale." And then the master turned to the girl and asked her what she was going to pay with, because Henis services are not cheap and are very expensive. But that was no trouble for Rosaline. She laughed and said, "You don't have to worry about that. She pays on the spot," who placed a pouch on the table from which blue emerald stones fell out. The girl said that she hoped for a useful cooperation. The next morning, Rosalina was still thinking about this guy, remembering the awkward moment when they ended up in an embrace. She sat there wondering why he was wearing that mask. Maybe because of the scar? As for the guild master, she doesn't know anything about him, and the novel doesn't mention anything about it either. Rosaline caught herself wondering what she was thinking about. She had to pull herself together, because that wasn't what was on her mind right now. Now you have to pay attention to other things, like money. She has plenty of it now. So now she has to summarize everything. First, the system window appeared, of course, only she sees it. Unlocked summoner abilities, Rosaline summoner level F. Last night she finally got her summoning ability, so she tried to get different things. She kept trying. "Silver ingot, come on!" But there was no way she could get it. The system was notifying her that the summoner could only get items that matched her level. The girl never gave up trying. Every day at night she tried to summon that silver bar. But the system kept telling her the same thing, that the summoner can only get items that are of his level. Rosalina got frustrated and started crying. With a freak out, she asked, and then what level she was, because the failures followed one after another. Back to the present, where Rosalina is sitting on the veranda, drinking tea in the cafe. She thought she should probably start with some small but useful thing appropriate to her level, so that could be it. There was a group of girls sitting next to Rosalina. Naturally, they all liked to gossip. They started talking. They started talking about whether they knew about the rumors. They say they're getting a divorce. She was doing a terrible job as a duchess. One of the girls said that she's probably embarrassed to say she just got kicked out, so she's telling everyone about the divorce. One of the girls said the title didn't suit her from the start. Always we laughed amicably, singing tea and gossiping. How suddenly they switched. The girl sitting next to her, one of them said that she had heard that originally the Duchess was supposed to be Count Bronzen's daughter. And she's right there among them. A very shy and modest girl, but that's just for them. She said no, could she? The girls immediately picked up on this, and began to tell them they could see better than anyone that it was an evil woman who had interfered with the pairing just before the engagement. "You must be upset, aren't you? You are such a beautiful and modest girl. They feel so sorry for you. Rosalina herself was sitting nearby and heard something from the neighboring table. A girl of the most innocent modesty suddenly began to cry, saying, "I'm sorry," to her friends. One of them put her arm around her shoulder and said, "Goodness, Lady Bronzena, you're all right. They all think the Duke is waiting for you." But only Lady Bronzena was thinking of something else entirely. She thought that of course he had been hers from the beginning. She is sure that Rosaline must hear her crying and the girls' discussion, so why doesn't she fit in? She knew it was enough to hurt this volcano to make it explode, and Rosaline will definitely not hesitate and do something that will completely ruin her reputation. Lady Bronzena starts wiping her tears, and the girl sitting next to her asks if she is okay. The girl replies, "Yes, thank you," but she's thinking something completely different. Lady Bronzena thinks about how Rosaline dares to take the prince away from her and take her place. She would never forgive such a thing. Lady Bronzena, seeing Rosalina nearby, asked casually, "Oh, that's her, isn't it? Miss Filesden?" All the girls turned around and looked at her. It was hard not to recognize her by her pink hair. After they called out to her, she had to turn around and look at them. The girls continued to gossip further, insulting her in full voice to make it harder for her. "Byron's misfortune! Filesden's villainous!" Lady Bronzena, for decency, tried to tell the girls to stop, but really it was to her advantage. One of the girls objected. They didn't say anything like that. Why on earth would she come? No conscience at all. Because divorce is not something to be proud of. It's better to stay home and keep a low profile. Miss Bronzena kept asking them to stop, but she kept waiting for Rosaline to react, but for some reason she doesn't say anything. Is she shocked at what's happening? Well, the girls continued to humiliate her. One by one she said, "And anyway, who would want to deal with that angry, hysterical girl?" Another said, "They say she's been abandoned by her family, and now she's been kicked out of the Duke's mansion." That's right, isn't it? That's right, that's why she's sitting here. By the way, what about Earl Bartner, who's in his 60s? He's recently taken a fourth wife. Miss Bronzena continued to comfort her friends again, saying that Miss Rosalina probably didn't mean for things to turn out this way. Stop insulting her! But she realized that hadn't Rosalina thought about the fact that coming to a place like this, where there would be women, they would be the ones to talk over her. One of the girls said, along with Bronzena, "It's a pity you're so good-hearted, but they don't call it Brighton's misfortune for nothing." For a second, Rosalina, sitting at her table, felt a pain in her chest. Rosaline's feelings remain in this body. Of course, so many insults. Is it possible to endure? She wanted to leave this place quietly, but she couldn't. The girl stood up and headed towards the gossip tables. Miss Bronzena thought, finally she's pissed off and heading towards them. This is where it's going to be. Walking over to the girls' table, Rosalina said, "So, according to rumors, what they say, discussing such things for fun, without checking if it's true or not. Are you ready to be held accountable? Unlike you, she wants to verify the authenticity of the facts." Pushing one of the girls aside with her hand, told her to step aside. While Rosaline turned her attention to Miss Bronzena, who told her she was serious about getting engaged to the Duke of Filesden. It's about her, isn't it? She should know better than anyone else. Then Rosalina turned around and was about to leave, saying, "Clearly it's just a rumor, since she has nothing to say," as Miss Bronzena suddenly shouted, "No, 4 years ago." The Duke came to the Bronzen Mansion. It was about the engagement. He was positive. Rosalina thought that all she had to do was dig a little and everything was laid out like it was in the palm of her hand. He said he would consider the offer. She thought about it. Then Rosalina replied, "Basically, she's spreading false information, maliciously telling everyone that she stole someone else's man, played the innocent sheep and watched the whole thing from the sidelines. How unpleasant, but she's in no mood even to quarrel. For you, Miss Bronzena, have no reason to call her a villain. Oh no, or maybe it's her lack of knowledge. She should have a woman to look up to." But Rosalina walked over, fixing Miss Bronzena's hair, and said, "Wasn't even that enough?" Then, instead of Rosalina, Miss Bronzena put up a fight. She took a swing at her, saying she was nothing, and how dare she. How suddenly Rosalina got some feeling, she didn't understand it yet. It was as if Rosalina's memories came back to her, and she remembered, and it was as if the real Rosalina had been instilled in her for a few seconds. Then the girl intercepted Miss Bronzena's arm to keep her from hitting her. and after Rosaline slapped Miss Bronzena with her other hand. Rosalina thought she was overreacting. The girl was in a panic, as if it wasn't her feelings. But she tried to get out of it by saying, "Act normal and don't bother other people. Go to Miss Bronzena." The girl stands dazed from the slap. Everyone around her saw the whole thing. Rosalina jumped out of the cafe and thought she had gotten herself into such a situation. But the struggle was not in vain. At least she was able to figure out how to use the skill. "We should go home and try again." Suddenly there was a foreman standing outside the cafe. He said, "Where is she going in such a hurry?" Rosalina said enthusiastically, "Oh, Guildmaster, what are you doing here?" The guy said that he had brought the contract and the report. The girl replied why she could have come herself. The Guildmaster started looking into the cafe and said that there seemed to be some commotion. At this point, Rosalina was pushing the guy off in the other direction, saying thank you very much that he was coming with the contract. He suspected from the girl's eyes that something was wrong, and she was purposefully not letting him in. Then he said he'd better check what happened, but Rosalina clutched at his arm and said, "Master, escort is needed, escort," and he agreed to walk her. They walked away from the cafe and walked forward. Walking down the road, Rosalina looked at the envelope and thought she wasn't interested in the interim report. Suddenly the master put his arm around her waist a little, and the girl noticed it. She thought, maybe he came here because he liked her, or he couldn't resist the wealth and beauty. At that moment, the guy thought that he couldn't sense any magic or any special skills from her. Rosalina turned to the guy holding out his report to him and said, "Okay, I'll let him call me Rosalina. No more Miss Filesden. Then the guy says the divorce is almost finalized. There's the option of Miss Brighton." Then the guy refused the documents for the time being and said he didn't want to. He is a very cautious person and does not like to do such things prematurely. He'll call her that when the divorce is finalized. All right, thought Rosaline. I wonder why he cares about such a trifle. He probably doesn't like her. The girl thought for a moment. The guy's behavior is completely unlike Rosalina. So awkward. It would be better to consider him just a business partner. The girl turned her head and saw smoke coming from a stall nearby. She thought, are there really chicken kebabs in this world? Rosalina and Arzention approached this stall. The guy took a kebab on a stick and offered it to Rosalina. In response, he asked the vendor, "How much will it cost?" Rosalina shouted sharply that she didn't want to stay in debt and leave it to her. After paying, the girl proceeded to eat the kebab as she suddenly noticed the guy had a fruity drink. Buying herself a fruit drink, she thought they even sell juice here. As suddenly the master suggested she look at something. The girl turned around and saw a standing unusual sculpture. She hadn't seen one like it before. Anyway, they had a nice walk and bought all sorts of stuff. Country fruits, vegetables. The guy was buying up everything. Everything that Rosalina pointed with her finger. The girl asked the master. He was interested. He wanted to eat. But the guy replied, "Of course not. It's all for her because she really enjoyed eating it." Rosalina stepped aside, she thought. He needs to stop being so nice to her. There's definitely a handsome man lurking beneath the mask. He's scaring her more and more. The girl kept catching herself thinking about business, not nonsense. Coming home after such a long shopping trip, the girl lay down to rest, and it was morning before she began her sorcery. Suddenly the thought occurred to her that she could summon something small and useful of her own level. A rose should do the trick. How could she forget that? After all, this world is simply obsessed with roses. The inhabitants of the empire, regardless of status, are either obsessed or the subject as it relates to the rose. The price goes up at least twice as much. Even the girl she'd seen in the cafe carried rose jewelry. Maybe she could summon a flower of an unusual color not found in the empire. So the girl began to summon. She wanted to summon a rose madly. She strained as hard as she could when she saw the rose petals in the air. She thought she was doing a perfect job. And it was going to be great. Now she would be rich. But when she looked at that rose, she was a little upset. As she took the rose in her hands, she realized it was too much. The rose wasn't even real. The rose was a beautiful harmony that brought joy. Level F. In the office of the Duke, Rosaline's father, the man asked something quietly. Even the butler himself noticed, saying calmly, "Yes." The Duke asked how Rosaline was. The butler replied that it was nothing special. She was fine. At that moment, the door to the room opened and Razeline walked in with the words, "Excuse me." The girl came in and said she had come to discuss something with the Duke. The father thought, my goodness, she came to say something herself. She was yelling before that they told her to leave, and now she's a stranger, so don't touch her. Rosalina couldn't understand why they were surprised, and then she remembered. She had forgotten that she should have knocked. The Duke asked what she wanted to say. The girl said, "Father, your birthday is coming up. It is, isn't it?" The Duke interjected, "What, a birthday? His?" He was even more surprised by her birthday question than she had just come to ask him something. And Rosalina said she was thinking that she had never given him a gift, so she decided. Bringing him a wrapped box with a gift, opening it, she said, "Here, for your birthday." It was a gold fountain pen. The father took this quill and tried to write something, but the girl said, "Really beautiful. But it's not really real. It's just an ordinary piece of gold, but it's still very beautiful, really, father." The Duke was very surprised at this gift. She said that she used to be so immature, and wants to show how much she's changed. Dad said, "Thank you, he really liked it." He put the pen on his desk. It is now like a souvenir to admire. But he himself wondered if he deserved the gift of this child. I mean, he kept turning his back on her. She's never acted like this before. He wondered if maybe he wasn't a parent to rely on after all. As the Duke sat and pondered, there was a knock on the room. A maid entered and said to the Duke that she had something to say. The Duke tensed and asked again about Razeline. At that moment, Rosalina took a bouquet of rose flowers and came to her mother's room. There were two maids standing near the entrance to the room. The girl thought, "Strange. This mansion is hers. Why is there so much that stands in her way?" As she came closer to them, she said she just wanted to get the best roses and decorate her mom's room with them, who had loved them dearly in her lifetime. But the word she heard in reply was, "You can't. No one is allowed to enter Beatrice's room without exception." One of the best stood and thought, "This wench has no power. We need to tighten up the timing a bit." Then the Duke sees the absurd situation as she tries to sneak into precious Beatrice's room. She doesn't think the Duke will forgive her.